Thomas Massie and Rand Paul are now at the center of a growing political storm in Washington. And once you hear what Massie has just said about the Epstein files, it becomes clear why the Department of Justice suddenly appears boxed in with nowhere left to turn. The clock is ticking. There is only 1 week remaining for the DOJ to either follow the law or openly violate it. Massie is not speculating or speaking in vague terms. He is issuing a direct warning. If the Department of Justice misses this deadline, he says it is not a matter of politics, not media drama, and not a procedural disagreement. It would be a criminal act. That statement alone has triggered panic, intense curiosity, and widespread speculation across Capitol Hill and beyond. When asked about the images released earlier today by Democrats on the House Oversight Committee from the Epstein estate, Massie said he had not seen them. But the focus quickly returned to the deadline facing the Department of Justice. With roughly a week left to comply with the Epstein Files Transparency Act, the DOJ is officially on the clock. The key question is whether the department will actually release the required files and comply with the law. Massie expressed cautious optimism. He pointed out that the DOJ went back to 3 separate judges and formally requested permission to release grand jury material under the new transparency law, according to Massie. All 3 judges reversed their previous positions, and for a clear legal reason. Each judge cited the Epstein Files Transparency Act as justification for releasing the materials. As a result, 3 separate grand juries are now set to provide their records to the DOJ, with victim names properly redacted. Massie described this as a positive sign, emphasizing that the DOJ's decision to return to the judges and request the grand jury material shows movement in the right direction. However, Massie made it clear that failure to release the files by next Friday would carry serious consequences. This would not be a situation where the DOJ could simply argue contempt of Congress or claim it failed to respond to a subpoena. This is different. Massie stressed that this is a newly enacted law with direct criminal penalties attached. Ignoring it would not be a technical mistake. It would be a violation of federal law. Still, he repeated that he was encouraged by the DOJ's actions so far, especially their successful efforts to secure the release of grand jury records. When asked whether the grand jury material alone would be enough to satisfy the law, Massie was blunt. He said no. In his view, the grand jury evidence represents only a small portion of what the DOJ is legally required to release. He explained that both the FBI and the Department of Justice likely possess large amounts of evidence that were never presented to a grand jury in the first place. According to Massie, much of that withheld evidence could implicate individuals other than Jeffrey Epstein or Ghislaine Maxwell. As a result, the grand jury records will likely contain mostly the facts and testimony that led to the convictions of those 2 individuals. Not the broader evidence the public is demanding. Massie emphasized that what Americans want to see are the documents, records, and evidence that the FBI and DOJ chose not to bring before any grand jury. That material, he argued, is essential for full transparency and accountability. Without it, the release would fall short of what the Epstein Files Transparency Act requires. The conversation then shifted to a separate issue involving the economy. When asked about the announcement that Ford and SK are ending their partnership on a massive battery park project in Kentucky, Massie offered a straightforward response. He said that companies with strong business models should invest with confidence. But if a business plan depends heavily on government subsidies, he warned investors should think carefully before moving forward. Massie suggested that the companies may have made their decision based on the expectation that the Biden administration or a Harris administration would remain in power and keep those subsidies in place. When that political calculation changed, so did the future of the project. Massie said he regrets that the state is losing the business, but he argued the project was built on a false assumption. According to him, the idea that consumers are overwhelmingly demanding electric vehicles simply is not true. He pushed back on the narrative that the collapse of the project was due to lawmakers failing to protect the industry. When Governor Beshear suggested that Congressman Guthrie did not do enough and pointed to support for the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, Massie disagreed. He made it clear that elections play a major role in outcomes like this. But more importantly, the underlying business model never truly worked. In his view, it was always going to rely on taxpayer money to stay afloat. Massie added that, while it is unfortunate to lose the investment, taxpayers may actually be better off. He argued that it makes no sense for the government to keep propping up a failing business model with public funds. He acknowledged the short-term loss for Kentucky, but stressed that the state has other legitimate business opportunities that do not depend on subsidies or political bets to survive. The conversation then returned to the Epstein investigation. One reporter apologized for joining late and asked Massie about the multiple developments happening at the same time, including the DOJ being forced to comply with the law, and the new information released by Democrats on the House Oversight Committee. Massie responded by laying out what he described as three parallel tracks moving forward simultaneously. First, there is the Oversight Committee continuing its work. Second, there is the judicial branch, which is now preparing to release grand jury materials. Third, there is the separate body of evidence currently held by the FBI and the Department of Justice. Massie said all three of these processes are moving rapidly and appear to be accelerating toward a conclusion. He also pushed back against earlier claims that the Epstein Files Transparency Act would fail or that it would somehow put victims' privacy at risk. Based on what is happening now, he said the law is doing exactly what it was intended to do. In his words, the bill is working. That point is critical because it changes the entire debate surrounding the Epstein files. This is no longer about political pressure, backroom negotiations, or arguments over whether the public deserves answers. The issue has now been narrowed to a single question. Will the Department of Justice obey a transparency law that was passed by Congress and signed by the President? Massie explained the situation in the simplest possible terms. The law contains a clear deadline. It lays out a clear requirement. And once those requirements are written into federal law, compliance is not optional. The Epstein Files Transparency Act does not allow the DOJ to consider political convenience, timing, embarrassment, or discomfort. It removes discretion entirely, which is why this moment has become so significant for years. The release of Epstein-related files has been treated as a political tug-of-war between parties. But with the new law now in effect, that framing no longer applies. The real question is no longer whether the DOJ will release something. The question is whether the DOJ will follow the law. And if it does not, the consequences are not symbolic or political. They are criminal. That is why this moment matters far more than any rumor, headline, or speculation surrounding the case. And that is exactly why longtime Washington insiders are watching this situation more closely than ever before. What makes this moment even more explosive is what has been happening quietly behind the scenes. Most people are unaware that the Department of Justice recently returned to 3 separate federal judges and asked them to release grand jury materials that had previously been sealed. These were not small requests, and the outcome was extraordinary. All 3 judges, across 3 different courts, reversed their earlier decisions. Each one pointed directly to the Epstein Files Transparency Act, acknowledging that the new law fundamentally changes the legal landscape. That reversal sent shockwaves through the legal community. Judges almost never reverse themselves unless there is a powerful legal reason to do so. In this case, the reason was simple and unavoidable. Congress passed a law mandating transparency, and the judiciary responded accordingly. Massie has called this development a positive sign, and on the surface, it is. But embedded within that good news is a much deeper and more troubling issue. Grand jury material, as Massie explains, represents only a very small portion of what the FBI and the DOJ actually possess. Prosecutors typically present only what they need to secure an indictment. They do not submit every piece of evidence they have. They avoid introducing highly sensitive material. They often leave out politically inconvenient information. And they rarely bring evidence that does not directly support the charges against the specific defendants in front of the jury. In the Epstein case, that means the grand jury records largely reflect the evidence used to convict Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, not the full scope of what federal investigators uncovered over many years. This distinction is why public expectations are now rising rapidly. People are not just interested in what the grand jury saw. They want to know what the grand jury never saw. For years, reports, leaked testimony, and persistent rumors have suggested that some of the most damaging information never entered a courtroom at all. Many Americans believe that names, connections, flight records, plea agreements, communications, photographs, and sealed interviews exist that were never included in any indictment or trial, whether every suspicion is accurate or not. Massie is pointing to an undeniable reality. The Epstein Files Transparency Act does not allow selective disclosure. The law requires the DOJ to release everything it has, not just the portions that were convenient to present in court. By focusing first on grand jury material, critics worry the DOJ may be attempting to ease public pressure, while still holding back the most sensitive and revealing evidence. That is where serious concern begins. And that is where this moment becomes larger than the Epstein case itself. If the Department of Justice releases only the materials that are easiest to share while withholding the most uncomfortable files, it is not complying with the law. It is sidestepping it. Massie does not spell this out directly, but his message is clear. When he says the grand jury material is only a small fraction of what exists, he is signaling something significant. According to Massie and various reports, the DOJ may possess files that were never presented precisely because they could implicate individuals beyond Epstein and Maxwell. Those files are believed to involve potential associates, high-profile visitors, facilitators, and others whose relationships with Epstein may never have been fully examined. And under the new law, those files are no longer protected by discretion. They are required to be released. And because none of that evidence was ever presented to a grand jury, the Department of Justice cannot claim those files are exempt from disclosure. The law simply does not allow for that kind of loophole. That is why the countdown is now so loud and impossible to ignore. For the first time since the Epstein scandal came to light, the federal government is operating under a strict legal deadline. Missing that deadline would not be a paperwork error or a bureaucratic delay. It would be a direct violation of federal law. What makes this situation even more revealing is what the DOJ has already shown it can do. The moment the department went back to federal judges and requested the unsealing of grand jury records, it proved something important, even if unintentionally. It demonstrated that the DOJ knows how to move fast when it chooses to. It knows how to petition the courts. It knows how to request legal exceptions. It understands how to adapt to new laws. It knows the procedures, the timelines, and what real compliance looks like. And that is exactly why the public is now asking a much harder question. If the DOJ can act quickly to release the material that is easiest to share, why has it not done the same for everything else? Why not for every document, every internal memo, every investigative summary, every interview, and every piece of evidence that was never shown to a grand jury and never made public? That is the question the Department of Justice has yet to answer. And it is the question that defines this entire moment. Once people understand that government agencies often withhold material not because it lacks relevance, but because it is sensitive, the conversation shifts. This is no longer about public curiosity or political drama. It becomes about accountability. And Massie is forcing that accountability into the national spotlight, whether the DOJ is comfortable with it or not. But this fight is not only about legal compliance. There is a powerful emotional dimension driving the urgency. Survivors were promised transparency. They were promised the truth. They were promised real answers. Instead, for years, they have watched critical files remain sealed, watched delays pile up, and watched institutions avoid disclosure by citing ongoing investigations. Each day those files remain hidden sends a painful message, intended or not, that protecting reputations may matter more than protecting victims. That slow erosion of public trust is exactly what Congress attempted to stop by passing this law. While some continue to argue that victim privacy justifies delay, Massie has addressed that concern directly. Victims' names can be redacted. Images can be blurred. Sensitive identifying details can be withheld. Courts handle these protections every day. Transparency and victim protection are not opposing goals. They never have been. When agencies behave as if releasing evidence automatically endangers victims, it often raises a different concern. It suggests that something else may be receiving protection, something that should not be. And that is why this deadline carries so much weight. For the first time, the law does not depend on voluntary cooperation or good faith promises. It demands compliance. It does not depend on which administration is in power. It does not hinge on political ideology or agency preference. This law is built on mandatory compliance, and it is backed by criminal penalties. That is why Massie's warning cuts straight through the noise. It removes politics from the equation entirely. This is not about party advantage. It is not about embarrassment. And it is not about who may or may not be connected to Epstein. It is about whether the Department of Justice is willing to obey a law that requires transparency, even when that transparency is uncomfortable. If the DOJ fails to comply, misses the deadline, drags out the process, or releases only selective pieces of information, the violation is already written into the statute. This would not be contempt of Congress. It would not be a technical error or procedural oversight. It would be a criminal act under federal law. And that is the point where this story becomes much bigger than the Epstein case itself. At its core, this moment raises a far more serious question. Does the rule of law apply to the very institutions that are responsible for enforcing it? Can a federal agency that prosecutes others for violating the law choose to violate the law itself? Will Congress stand behind its own mandate if that happens? And if it does not, what precedent does that set for future transparency laws? These questions matter because once a government agency ignores one transparency requirement, ignoring the next one becomes easier. When that pattern starts, oversight weakens, accountability fades, public trust erodes, and the foundation of democratic governance takes damage. That is the real test unfolding right now. And it explains why this moment feels so intense. 3 separate lanes of accountability are moving at the same time. The House Oversight Committee is pressing forward. The federal courts have responded. Congress has passed the law and done its part. Now the full spotlight is on the Department of Justice. With each passing day, the public is watching closely. Not just to learn what is inside the Epstein files, but to see whether the institutions that promise transparency are willing to deliver it. If the DOJ follows the law, this could become one of the most significant transparency actions in modern political history. If it does not, the focus shifts away from Epstein and lands directly on the federal government itself. For anyone paying attention and anyone who cares about accountability, this is the moment to stay alert. The countdown is real. The stakes are high. And the outcome could reshape how Americans view the justice system for years to come. Stay connected, share your thoughts, and follow along closely as this story continues to unfold.